Today I'm going to talk about the problems that surround expanding access to secondary schooling in low-income countries. It really is a right and a commitment that every child should have access to a full cycle of basic education. What that now means is quite clear. It means at least until grade 9. And because of the success of education for all, the number of children reaching the end of primary school successfully has been rising very rapidly. In some countries we've seen as a doubling of numbers graduating from primary school in 10 years. This clearly creates a lot of additional demand for access to secondary school. And it is the case, of course, that if the transition rate from primary to secondary school is not sustained, if it starts to fall sharply, then it's highly unlikely that it will be possible to universalise completion of primary schooling. The marginal child, the marginal household will simply give up if there's not much chance of going to secondary school. There are countries which are post-conflict and fragile, which have lost a generation of people in the middle. That is, a generation of young men and young women who, through circumstances probably outside their control, are simply not there. Or if they are there, their schooling was interrupted and they didn't have the benefit of attending primary school or secondary school. In those countries, secondary schooling may occupy a special role in terms of rebuilding a cadre and recreating capacity that's been lost. The competition for jobs in Africa and in South Asia is increasing rapidly, and these are jobs in the modern sector. These are jobs that require educational qualifications, and increasingly there are jobs that require secondary schooling. As primary schooling becomes more and more common, the marginal rate of return on it of course drops because it's no longer scarce. But what is scarce are secondary school graduates of quality who have completed 9, 10 or even 12 years of schooling successfully and have mastered the learning outcomes associated with that level. That competition will be fierce, and of course it's about competition between individuals for desirable roles in the labour market. It's also about competition between countries. Demographic transition and improved health and well-being are very clearly correlated with the number of years that people spend in school. That case is overwhelming and really is not contested that secondary schooling adds to a pattern of increased well-being and health and nutrition for mothers, for fathers and for children. Poverty reduction, of course, does depend, at least in part, on social mobility. And if you don't have equitable access to secondary schooling, then you won't have social mobility and you won't have sponsored social mobility, which will draw people from poor households into the mainstream. And the last reason I think that one would want to invite careful consideration of how best to expand access to secondary school is about social cohesion. It's about realising the commitments that pretty much all governments make to equality of educational opportunity. It's about providing public goods that do reach all citizens, both because it's more efficient and because simply it's fairer. I'm now going to move on to the next part of this talk and say something about the status of secondary schooling. In Africa, the most common length of primary schooling is 6 years, but there are a few countries where it's 5 years, and there are a few where it's 7 and just 1 or 2 where it's 8. Clearly these are choices, the length of the cycle. They're choices that come with costs of a financial kind, the longer the more expensive, but there are also choices that come with implications for secondary schooling, the point at which selection takes place, the point at which there is transition from a primary school environment to a secondary school environment. Let me move on to say something about the evolution of enrolments. You will see a chart in front of you which plots the gross enrolment rates at primary across a number of African countries and the gross enrolment rates at lower and upper secondary. From that chart you will see immediately that there is no close correlation between the enrolment rates at primary and at lower or upper secondary, though lower and upper secondary enrolments correlate with each other. And why is it significant? Well, the chart, amongst other things, shows the distance that some countries will have to travel if they are to provide universal access. The chart is showing that there is a policy choice about how much secondary schooling to have, which is not simply related to wealth. It's a structural choice and it may be influenced by other things, but it clearly varies greatly between countries. The next chart draws attention to how the enrolment rates have been changing over time. And you can see from the two lines the difference between the enrolment rates in 1999 at lower secondary and the enrolment rates in 2010 at lower secondary. Again, the correlation between these two numbers is not very high, but it does show very clearly that in almost all the countries, enrolment rates have indeed improved. This chart shows enrolments, and these are not enrolment rates, these are absolute numbers of enrolments, in 4 different countries over the last 10 years. And they give a picture of how primary and secondary school enrolments have been evolving. They provide a very stark and very obvious reminder that different countries in Africa and elsewhere have very different patterns. The two charts that you can see in front of you now take low enrolment countries in Africa and demonstrate how far there is a need to travel from current enrolment rates at secondary level above grade 6 to reach the age cohort size. The chart which you can now see shows that where the blue line is greater than the red line, there has been a change in the GPI, the Gender Participation Index, in favour of boys. Where the red line is greater than the blue line, the change has been in favour of girls. And you can see that in pretty much 3/4 of the countries, the relative position of girls has improved in relation to boys. The 4 charts you see in front of you group countries in Africa into 4 different cases. In the first case is a pattern where from grade 1 it's generally true that there are more boys in secondary school than there are girls. And in some of those cases, by grade 9 or grade 10, the proportion of girls in the system is down to not much more than 35%. We can compare that with the chart to the right of your screen, which shows that through the primary school grades, the GPI is between 45% and 50%, indicating that there are a few more boys but not a lot more. But above grade 6 there's a clear falling off in the secondary grades, where the transition rate is greater for boys and the dropout rate for girls may be greater than it is for boys, so the proportion of girls diminishes. In the third group of countries, in the bottom quadrant, you can see that throughout grade 1 to 9, and even in some of the countries up to grade 12, there are pretty much as many girls as boys. These are typically higher enrolment countries, but not all. Some of them are low enrolment countries. And in the last group of countries, which are high enrolment countries, almost invariably above the primary grades, there are more girls enrolled than boys. This chart distributes participation by household income in different countries in Africa. I pick out, by way of example, Sierra Leone. In this household-based sample, the poorest children and the richest children have dramatically different chances of being enrolled. Those in the poorest quintile are much less likely to be in secondary school than those in the richest quintile. In Tanzania, if you're in Mbeya, you have a much smaller chance of being in secondary school than you would be in Town West. There are about 10 things that I think are worth considering systematically as representing the main challenges that confront expanded secondary schooling in Africa, which is sustainable, which is financially sustainable, and which contributes to greater equity. The first is the challenge of planning and manage expansion in ways which doesn't undermine quality. Secondary schooling in Africa and South Asia is often expensive. It can be between 4 and 6 times as much per child to deliver than primary schooling. At those kind of cost ratios, it is impossible to universalise it. Universalising access to secondary schooling will require new approaches, particularly to the development of small secondary schools, which can offer a full range of curriculum. Secondary schooling is highly regressively financed at the moment and is inhabited mostly by children from richer quintile households. Obviously gender equity is a goal, and so is increasing the chances of people from rural areas and townships experiencing secondary schooling. We should not forget also, of course, that disability and membership of particular social groups is often a factor which causes exclusion from secondary schooling. There is a striking challenge for expanded access to secondary schooling at a curriculum and pedagogic level. Moving from systems which historically recruited 10 or 20% of an age group to systems that recruit 90 or 100% means embracing the needs and wants of children who are characteristically different from those who have survived selection tests in the past. Another key issue that we need to address is training and deploying a sufficient number of new teachers efficiently and effectively. We need to address questions about how to attract the best students into secondary school teaching. Other things which are essential to expanded secondary schooling are to make much more use of formative assessment, which can diagnose learning problems, which can identify misconceptions, and which can help identify the most effective pedagogies. It is important that those high-stakes assessments promote learning goals which include higher-level cognitive capabilities. It is important that they have predictive validity, and it is important that selection where it takes place is equitable and does not favour some groups over others for reasons unrelated to their capability. Lastly, and related to that, are needs to invest in constructive monitoring and inspection systems of schools that can manage growth in a way which does meet the challenge of maintaining quality whilst extending the reach of systems which historically have been for selected elites to the mass of the people.